welcome back to Historiahe with Karil and
Jagar,
where we make factual chismis about the history of the Philippines. And in this episode, we will talk about the long and controversial West Philippine Sea with a twist. So we are going to talk about this controversial topic with two very controversial people in Philippine politics. Amazing, right?
Right.
And these two controversial people are, drumroll please, dun, 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 former President Rodrigo Duterte and the current President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Now we have two very insightful and amazing people with you to Chica today, Miss Princess Tomorrow and Mr. Real Angelo Valdueza. Say hi, you guys! Now for our listeners, tell us about how or where did this issue begin?
Okay, in understanding the issue, I think first we need to establish the natural tendency of nations to have states to have territorial boundaries in their exclusive economic zone, because we're talking about maritime territorial boundaries, and that's quite different from geography, right? And it's normal for states to have overlapping territories because these are uncharted waters, quite different from the physical territorial boundaries in the geography. But the issue actually started when China claims that the entire West Philippine Sea, almost 90% of the West Philippine Sea, was claimed by them, and as basis for their claim, they have this historical 9-dash line. Yeah. You have this 9-dash line which claims the entirety of almost the entire West Philippine Sea, and knowing that West Philippine Sea holds 1/3 of the entire trademarks in maritime trades, and holding a lot of, oil, and, there's a lot of resources in that body of water. So I think that's where the issue started, when China tries to claim the entire sea waters, and the Philippines has been overlapped by their claim.
Oh, so you're saying that this is all because of the China's greediness?
Let's try to be professional in this talk, right? I'm not gonna say greediness. I'm gonna say interest. China has interest, and because China is the most powerful state among the neighbors claiming some area in the West Philippine Sea, including the Philippines, China is essentially more powerful than the Philippines. That's why they have every ability to actually assert their right as one of their own, even if this existentially overlaps the EEZ of the Philippines.
Okay, interest. Okay. Moving on to our second question. How is the current issue and how is it affecting the Philippines?
So if we were to assess the current issue, there are a lot of China's militarization that is happening in the West Philippine Sea, and there are a lot of encroachment when it comes to the exclusive economic zone of the country. So these tensions have overall implications for the regional stability, the maritime security, together with the livelihood, of course, of, the poor Filipino fishermen who rely merely on these areas for their own livelihood. So this is a lot of impacts, but if we are to jot it down into various points, we can actually jot it down into 4 points. Though various impacts would include, for example, first is the national sovereignty. So of course, since it's our country, the Philippines asserts its its sovereignty over the West Philippine Sea, because based on the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, or the UNCLOS ruling, it's the country's right to assert its own jurisdiction because according to the ruling, it's ours. But secondly, more than just the national sovereignty being threatened, it's the economic impact, because the West Philippine Sea, as what Real have mentioned, is rich, right? When it comes to maritime resources per se, the fish, the oil, the natural gas. So the presence of various foreign vessels, particularly from China, does disrupts these activities that is going on, which includes the fishing activities and the exploration for oil and even the gas resources. So it doesn't just affect the people living in that area, but also the kind of economic activities that is happening and that could potentially allow the country for more economic gains. Thirdly, when we talk about security concerns, of course, the militarization that is present, there have been reports of aggressive encounters between Chinese and Filipino vessels. So this then heightened the tensions in the region and leads us to the question of security, not just for the entire country, but for these mere fishermen, for example, that is just there for their own livelihood. And then, of course, lastly, for the diplomatic relationships. When we talk about the issues straining the diplomatic relations between Philippines and China, as well as the other countries involved in the disputes, the ASEAN countries per se, that is in between of these issues per se that is present. So the Philippines have continuously sought for international support in arbitration, but the continuous aggression and the militarization that is present within its own economic, its own territory and its own exclusive economic zone is present. So this does affect the entirety of these points that has jotted down, such as sovereignty, economic impact, and the various security concerns that is present.
Oh wow, Princess, that's a lot to digest actually. So let's just move on to our next question since this is just really connected to the second question that is asked. How was the issue handled by the administration of both the present and the current?
So we have heard from both speakers how heavy it is and how the magnitude really affects the Filipino people, right? And it is the burden that the executive office essentially has to carry on its back. And we need to remember that as the driver of the foreign policy, we need to have the driver of the foreign policy, or the president, has to consider the integrity of our territorial boundaries as provided for in the Constitution. But also, we need to remember that as the driver of foreign policy, he has to consider the weight of the benefit of the Filipino people, or which side does the Filipino people benefit the most, even if it means surrendering that national integrity, right? And that's where the difference comes from. That's where the difference between the two administrations in handling the issue is essentially analyzed from. Looking at Duterte's administration, we can say that as a holistic approach, he took this quite sober approach where he considers the probable instability that it can cause when asserting our sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea. He saw the danger of really asserting our rights using our arbitrary award assertively and quite declaratively against China, and he saw how dangerous it might be, and so he took a kind of a sober approach and took the level, didn't really use the arbitrary ruling assertively and just, made dealings with China as a safety net to somehow not cause them to do harm, but at the same time continue our relations with China. On the other hand, in Marcos' administration, we can see that as a holistic approach, he took this quite aggressive approach with contrast to Duterte. He didn't quite consider the danger that China would cause. He actually leaned into the mutual defense treaty and the bilateral connection we have with US, and therefore he used the tribunal ruling that we had in 2016 quite declaratively and assertively, aggressively asserting our rights as Filipino citizens in our sovereign areas in the territorial waters provided for the tribunal ruling that we received during 2016.
Wow, so from your answer, I'll definitely never want to be a president. From what I can gather from your answer is that there's a lot to consider when you become a president. You have to consider the national interest as well as the interest of the public. So it's definitely a lot to take, especially for me, where I just want to follow what I want.
Yes, it's really hard. And if I were you also, if I were given the chance to be the president, I would never be the president because that's just too much. It takes a lot of courage, right? It takes a lot of vitality to consider those things and to be the decision-making prowess of the entire state, where the entire state relies upon you. It's just like, there's this girl that you like, and that girl has someone pursuing her for the past 6 months, and you really like this girl, and you're stuck with the decisions, you're stuck with the choices that if you pursue this girl, that's someone that she had a fling for a couple of months already might actually punch you in the face, or so you're stuck with the choices to pursue this girl and risk your safety, or pursue your own, to secure your own safety while actually losing the girl, right? And those two things are quite different, and it's just up to the president on what matters does he think is the most important, and the thing that must be most accommodated in the foreign policy.
Wow, so Real has pinanghuhugutan talaga with his answers. Okay, so moving on to our fourth question, in connection with the third, how did the mechanism affect the Philippines?
So there are a lot of mechanisms that the Philippines actually did when it comes to the issue of West Philippine Sea. But the question is, are these mechanisms enough? Of course not, because what in this world is enough, right? Even sometimes our love isn't enough to, fight it through it all. But that's life. But when it comes to jokes aside, when it comes to the effects of these mechanisms present, there are four that we can actually jot down. First is when you talk about the diplomatic effort. So there are mechanisms that is done by the Philippines when it comes to countering these issues. So we have engaged in various diplomatic negotiations with China, as what Real said during the Duterte administration per se. And there are a lot of issues and parties that were involved in this dispute, and we seek to try to engage into diplomatic negotiations and find peaceful resolution within this issue within them, right? The efforts that we aim to assert the Philippines' rights under the international law, but at the same time maintaining the cordial relationship with our neighboring countries. And this was something that was very much evident during the Duterte administration. But the progress is evidently slow. It's very slow. It's like a turtle running, for example. And significant challenges remain when it comes to reaching the mutually acceptable solution that we have. But secondly, when we talk about the legal arbitration, we have continuously initiated the arbitration and the proceedings against China under the UNCLOS. The Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague has ruled against China's sweeping historical claims in the waterway. And Beijing have continuously refused to acknowledge the ruling. And in 2016, an international tribunal favored the Philippines, but of course, this was as well, the China's expansive claims and activities in the South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea, were a constant manifestation of as to how they rejected this ruling. So there are a lot of mechanisms that has already been done.
But how about the ASEAN, Princess? How did they participate, or was ASEAN even present in this issue?
Very good question on where ASEAN is in the conversation, right? So the Philippines have continuously sought support from regional and international organizations, let's say the United Nations, for example, and including the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, or the ASEAN. But a consensus on a unified approach has continuously been challenging due to the differing interests and priorities among member states. Because as what Real said, right? Like, states have their own interests. So of course, when it comes to achieving consensus on such controversial issue, there comes to be various bumps along the way. And when it comes to domestic policies, the Philippines have continuously implemented and tried to strengthen their maritime capabilities. And these mechanisms have led to these effects, wherein we continuously modernize our Philippine Navy and Coast Guard, and we enhance the surveillance and monitoring capabilities of these organizations and strengthen partnership allies that we could when it comes to United States of America, Japan, and South Korea and Australia. So these are mechanisms done and the impacts of them.
Oh, okay, so the ASEAN is present. Alright, you guys, on to our next question, where the heated arguments begin. Now, when it comes to policy making and the approach taken in solving the issue, who did it better?
So I told you earlier that in the Duterte administration's case, he actually had this sober approach where he tries to secure the existential security of the entire state instead of asserting our territorial rights in the waters, right? But in the side of Duterte, he actually did try to solve the issue by having diplomatic relations directly with the other party. And in this case, it's China, right? He actually had multiple occasions where he had agreements with China, diplomatic relations, but going back to the sober predisposition of his foreign policy, which is the potentiality of danger in the waters and that might actually potentially harm the Filipino people or the state. One of those multiple discussions that he had with Xi Jinping, the leader of China, is when he asserted the tribunal ruling that we won in 2016. And Xi Jinping actually said that we should not mention that because things will be in trouble. And I think that's where the predisposition comes from, that potentiality of danger for the Filipinos has been in the mind of Duterte, and he actually did consider that seriously, and that's why he's been arguing to not really assert our rights in the territorial waters through directly pushing forth the tribunal ruling that we had and fighting directly for our rights, but rather have discussions with China and maintain our connections, economic connections with China, economic relations, which is actually one of the biggest, economic partners with the state. And when it comes with bilateral connections with the international community, I think that's where Duterte becomes quite unpopular, because in history, it's us and the US, right? It's us and the US having connections with one another. We actually have a mutual defense treaty, but in Duterte's case, he never really used this pretty much. He never really used this mutual defense treaty much, and even the tribunal ruling that we had in 2016. And that's where he gets unpopular in the side of the Filipinos and even international community. And I think we all get it, why Duterte is quite unpopular in the international community, because of his demeanor, of his attitudes. But that's it for the foreign policy. We know his sober approach, and he took a quite different approach that was made by President BBM. What do you think? What is the approach taken by BBM anyways?
So, as much as whether we like it or not, we have to trade off with the certain facts that there are indeed approaches done by BBM. So, unlike the inconsistent stand of Duterte and his sober approach towards the issue, as what Real have stated, there's a firm and consistent approach that President Marcos Jr. have jot down when it comes to the issue of the West Philippine Sea. This could look like the continuous balikatan exercises, for example, within countries, the continuous militarization of the Philippine Coast Guard. But not so recently, for example, following the attack of the Chinese Coast Guard towards the poor Filipino fishermen, an executive order was eventually released, which we call it as the EO57, which strengthened the Philippines' maritime security and maritime domain awareness. The creation of the NMC, which led to that, or the National Maritime Council. This is a clear manifestation of as to how we try to solve issues domestically, and we try to stick with what is on our legal grounds, on the rights that we actually have in our country, rather than trying to approach it in such sober way. Because as far as President Marcos Jr. have been concerned, there is consistency on his foreign policy in the continuous multilateral and bilateral conversations that he had with countries such as South Korea, Japan, for example, and United States, and the continuous assertion of our sovereignty towards our own domestic jurisdiction has been explicitly said. And these certain efforts, such as these executive orders and the continuous improvement of our maritime guards together with the Philippine Navy and the Philippine Coast Guard, is a clear manifestation that even if by then that there are possible trade-offs that the country is willing to take, these are certain measures that the country would be sticking into, because at the very end of the day, it's a right, and it's not easy to just simply watch our fishermen continuously being thrown away in their own waters, the waters that they were supposed to be enjoying, and their rights being continuously trampled within the waters that they own at the very end of the day.
You guys are so good at this.
Yeah, right. Those are really, really good points. Now, on to our last and probably one of the questions that will have the most heated arguments is, in terms of serving the interests of the public, who do you think did it better?
Looking at national interest and public interest, those areas of waters in the West Philippine Sea is actually one of those. We can say that because it was told earlier that one-third of trade, I told you earlier that one-third of the trade, maritime trades happen in that area. And there's actually a lot of gas, a lot of natural resources in that area, as well as fishes, right? And it's actually it's actually provided for in the Constitution that one of the national interests is having this national integrity when it comes with territorial boundaries, and having to really assert our rights in those areas that we consider ours. But in the side of Duterte, the most important thing that he actually considers, and he considers as the main or the national interest, or what the public needs in the current situation, is that existential crisis, that existential risk of actually having a war between China and us, or even Worse, having US as an ally of ours. So he had this existential crisis and existential security, perceived it as the most important thing that we must consider and that he must consider as the driver of the foreign policy in terms of solving the issue. That's why he has been really sober and really silent about asserting our tribunal rights, using the tribunal ruling that we had in 2016, and really to have our allyship with the United States, and to continue aggressively assert that as a showmanship against the Chinese administration. And that's why he had these multiple connections with China, because he perceives that through making diplomatic agreements with China and continuing our economic relations together, we might actually lessen the risk of this potential disaster that the Filipino people might actually suffer. And that, I think, is the national interest that he perceives to be the most important, and he served it really well.
When we try to look at the issue, we can think of it using, two perspectives. Firstly, when we try to understand from the perspective of the nation itself or the state, and when it comes to the national government, right? How is the interest of the people better served? We can look at it from the perspective wherein looking at the consistent policy of the Marcos Jr. administration, the consistent establishment of how the country should be reacting on these kinds of aggression present. The policies, the continuous talk, the continuous negotiations, and per se, this does then lead us to understanding that, hey, the Marcos's administration have a consistent policy that would, at best, cater the best interests of the Filipino people. Because the question here is that, up to what extent, right? Up to what extent will we continuously allow these Filipino fishermen to continuously be bullied, for our Coast Guard to be continuously insulted, and for the sovereignty of our state to be continuously trampled, right? Like, up to what extent will we be able to suffer and to just try to be patient and wait because we want a stable ground, we want stability in the country? The question of extent is at now very alarming, considering the amount of attacks that have continuously happened in these seas. But second, let's take a look at it from the public perception. When we understand their interest, we try to understand as well and listen to the feedbacks that we would be hearing from the general public. A research in 2024 recently in April showed that the Marcos's Jr. administration have gained a 58% jump from 15 points jump from the July 2023 Octa Research Group, which was conducted in the previous poll. This 15% or this 15-point increase from the 43% recorded in the second quarter have continuously been allotted, and whose opinion was heavily reliant on how Marcos have dealt with the West Philippine Sea, meaning that the increase of the public perception and satisfactory rate of Marcos was because of the amount of trust that they have and the amount of satisfaction that they have on as to how he dealt with this issue. So when we look at it from the national perspective, understanding the need for continuous defense and looking at it from the perception of the people on how they better catered and how they are better satisfied with a public policy which they perceive to be beneficial and best represents their interest, we can understand it, and as to how Marcos's Jr. administration have given that numbers-wise and facts-wise. And I guess that would better answer this question, looking at it from those perspectives.
Okay, wow. So that was a very intense discussion. I can almost taste the implicated misfortune from your insights, guys. All I can say is that, hi, Historia, hey! Now, just to break off all these tensions, let us move on to our next segment, Historia, hey, fastly. I will be asking you questions, answer them quickly with one word or one sentence only. You will be answering mostly in turns. Are you ready? Actually, it doesn't matter. Let's start. Princess first. Describe Duterte in one word.
Ngarag.
Real. Marcos is...
Bad.
If you were to choose breakfast with Marcos or dinner with VP Sara,
VP Sara dinner.
do you believe Duterte is the type to be there to care for you if you were ill?
Yes, of course.
Your candidate for best senator currently in position.
Risa Ontiveros.
Favorite president.
Rodrigo Duterte.
On this one, you two may answer Princess first. Favorite Philippine political event in history?
EDSA DOS.
It's a no for me.
That's mine.
Okay. Let's move on. This time, both will still answer. The end will always justify the means. Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. No, pero let's move on. Princess, if you were to write a book about the two latest presidents, Duterte and Marcos, what would the title of this book be?
Okay, but not best.
The sober versus the drunkard.
Okay. This time, real first. What do you value most in Philippine politics?
Realism.
Liberty.
Both of you still? Free market or command economy?
Free market.
Free market.
Moving away from a political question, both of you, if you could be any fictional character, who would you be?
Wonder Woman.
Superman.
Favorite Filipino film?
Four Sisters in the Wedding.
Private Benjamin.
Favorite conspiracy theory?
Bermuda Triangle.
One.
Criminal Minds.
That is all for today's episode of Historiahi. We hope you've enjoyed, and the listeners as well, of course. We hope you guys learned something from today's episode. Join us again as we continue to chismis about the facts about Philippine history. Remember to stay informed
Stay curious.
and stay engaged. Until next time, we are your chismosing hosts, Karil and
Jagar.
signing off. Mabuhay!